Welcome to Sweetly Bored and Calm Vibes, where calm meets cozy. Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the culinary landscape of medieval times. As you settle in for a moment of calm and relaxation, I invite you to share in the comments what part of the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I love to see how far our community of night owls stretches. If you enjoy delving into the rich tapestry of history for relaxation, consider subscribing for more gentle stories like this one. Imagine, if you will, a rustic table set with a humble meal, a thin and bone gruel, a piece of dense, coarse bread, and perhaps a few morsels of tough, stringy meat if the diner was lucky. This was the diet that sustained most people in the Middle Ages. While kings and nobles feasted on lavish multi-course banquets, common peasants subsisted on a diet as meager as it was monotonous. What factors conspired to make food in the Middle Ages so unappetizing for the masses? Let's explore this question and transport ourselves back to a time when filling one's belly was a daily struggle. In the home of a medieval peasant, the aroma of exotic spices was conspicuously absent. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper were luxuries reserved for the rich, brought from distant lands by intrepid traders. Imagine the life of a spice merchant in those times, navigating the treacherous Silk Road to bring a taste of opulence to European shores. To get a sense of the value placed on these rare flavors, consider that in the 10th century, a pound of nutmeg cost 7 fat oxen. The prohibitive cost of spices meant that common folk had to make do with the pungent notes of garlic, mustard, and vinegar to liven up their plain fare. The blandness of peasant cuisine was not helped by the scarcity of fresh produce. With no reliable means of preservation, fruits and vegetables were, at best, seasonal treats. The lucky few who had access to a plot of land could cultivate a few hardy crops like onions, leeks, and cabbages, but this was hardly enough to balance a diet heavily reliant on grains. Breads and pottage made from barley, rye, and wheat formed the backbone of most meals, sometimes supplemented by legumes like peas and beans. While this diet was filling, it lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth. Meat, while valued, was a rarity on the peasant's table. A prosperous family might own a pig, a few chickens, or even a cow, but these animals were valuable resources, not to be slaughtered lightly. Meat was reserved for special occasions, like weddings and religious festivals, or when an animal was too old or infirm to serve any other purpose. When meat was available, every scrap was used from nose to tail. Offal or organ meats were common peasant dishes, as were small birds and game caught by traps or hunting. Though poaching in royal forests was a risky endeavor, punishable by severe penalties. Fish was more accessible than meat for those living near rivers or the sea, but it too was often preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to last in times of scarcity. The result was far from the delicate flaky fillets we enjoy today. Herring, cod, and engie were among the most common catches and were packed into barrels with large quantities of salt to prevent spoilage. Freshwater fish like carp and pike were a delicacy reserved for the nobility, who kept private fish ponds on their estates. The scarcity of fresh foods meant that medieval cooks had to be creative with preservation methods. Pickling, fermenting, and drying were all common techniques to extend the shelf life of perishables. Cabbage was chopped and fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions pickled in vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears dried for winter storage. These preserved foods added some much-needed variety to the peasant diet, but they were a far cry from the vibrant flavors of fresh produce. Even staples like bread and ale, which formed the bedrock of medieval sustenance, were not always reliable. Unscrupulous bakers might stretch their dough with fillers like ground acorns, geese, or even sawdust, resulting in loaves as hard as rocks and as nutritious as that. Ale, too, was often watered down to boost profits, a practice that earned some alewomen an unsavory reputation. In an age when clean drinking water was scarce, weak ale was often the only safe choice, as the brewing process helped to kill harmful bacteria. This brings us, perhaps, to the most unappetizing aspect of medieval cuisine, the utter lack of hygiene. Without an understanding of germs and food safety, contamination was widespread. Livestock were often kept close to living quarters for warmth and protection, their waste seeping into the same areas where food was prepared and consumed. In overcrowded towns, rubbish and human waste filled the streets, contaminating water sources and attracting vermin. It's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were rampant, with even royalty not immune to the dangers of spoiled food. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after overindulging on peaches and sudrover, a feast that likely led to a fatal case of dysentery. The spectre of disease was never far from the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which decimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 11th century, spread in part due to the unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were particularly notorious as hotbeds of pestilence, with flies buzzing around meat stalls and rodents scurrying beneath the species. It's a wonder that anyone survived the perils of medieval cuisine. Yet, even in the face of scarcity and disease, there were glimmers of gastronomic hope. Monasteries and abbeys often served as havens of relative abundance, with well-tended gardens and orchards providing a bounty of fresh produce. Monks were known for their culinary skills, with some even writing cookbooks that offered a glimpse into the more refined cuisine of the upper echelons. Of course, such food was not freely shared with the masses, but some monasteries did offer alms to the poor as a form of charity. For the nobility, banquets were an opportunity to display their wealth and power. A royal feast could feature dozens of dishes from roasted swan and peacock to delicate éders and sweets. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttony and revelry. But even these plentiful tables were not without their dangers. Food poisoning was common, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces taking their toll on noble stomachs, and the sheer volume of food consumed could lead to painful digestive issues. A reminder that even the privileged were not immune to the perils of medieval cuisine. As we reflect on the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for the abundance and variety we enjoy today. Our supermarkets overflow with fresh produce from around the world. Our meats are safe and sanitized, and our spice racks hold flavors that would have been the envy of any medieval monarch. Yet, even as we savor the fruits of modernity, we cannot help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who made do with so little and found ways to survive in the face of relentless hardship. So, the next time you sit down for a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you. Savor the flavors and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of. And raise a toast to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point. And if you find yourself grumbling about a less than perfect dish, spare a thought for the medieval diner, for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a hard-won blessing. As we let our minds wander back to that distant past, let us find comfort in the knowledge that we are the fortunate heirs of centuries of culinary progress. And let us not forget the lessons that history has to teach us. Lessons of perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of times. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity, but a source of endless pleasure. May your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warmth of gratitude for all that we have been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of banquets yet to come. Part 4. Adulterated Food and Drink. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval town, a baker glances surreptitiously left and right before turning back to his shop. He pulls out a sack of sawdust and begins kneading it into the dough, stretching his meager supply of flour. For many bakers, this deception was the only way to eke out a modest living. Bread was the lifeblood of the medieval diet, yet its purity was often compromised. Unscrupulous bakers added fillers like ground acorns, geese, or sawdust to extend their dough. What resulted was a coarse, gritty bread that offered little nutrition. The very staple that sustained peasants in their toil had become yet another hardship to endure. Ale and wine also fell victim to the desperation of the age. Alewives and innkeepers, struggling to turn a profit, watered down their brew to extend it further. The resulting drink was a thin, sour wash that bore little resemblance to the robust ale that was the pride of the British Isles. One such alewife, Elizabeth, toils over her bubbling cauldron, stirring in yet another bucket of murky water. Her children hover nearby, their hungry eyes watching every drop, knowing their next meal depends on this batch. As she pours out a tankard of the watery brew, she sighs, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale her grandmother once brewed, a family recipe now lost to necessity. In an age when clean drinking water was a rarity, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate necessity. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste, making them rife with disease. The alcohol in these beverages, though diluted, was still potent enough to kill some of the harmful bacteria. And so, peasants were forced to choose between risking disease from contaminated water or the empty calories of watered-down ale. Attempts were made to curb these deceptive practices. The Viceaser of Bread and Ale, an 11th-century lore, laid down strict regulations on the price, weight, and quality of bread and beer. Transgressors faced heavy fines or even time in the pillory. But with the limited means of enforcement and the desperation of the poor, these laws did little to stem the tide of food adulteration. And so, the medieval peasant's lot was one of constant compromise, a balancing act between the gnawing pain of hunger and the bitter disappointment of adulterated food. Each bite was a reminder of their precarious existence, where even the most basic sustenance could not be taken for granted. As we delve further into the realities of medieval food, we must remember that these were not merely historical facts, but the daily struggles of real people. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the very spaces in which they lived contributed to the challenges they faced in securing a decent meal. The cramped quarters shared by man and animal, and the lack of sanitation that plagued medieval towns made the simple act of eating a dangerous proposition. Part 5. Unsanitary Conditions. Imagine, if you will, a small, thatched roof hovel nestled against the chill of a medieval winter. Inside, a family huddles around a meagre fire, their breaths mingling with steam rising from a bubbling pot of mindle. In the corner, a pig roots through the straw that covers the dirt floor. It grunts and groans, a constant backdrop to the family's daily life. This was the reality for many medieval peasants. A life lived in close quarters with their animals. Animals were often kept indoors for warmth and safety, their manure and detritus mixing with the straw and reeds that served as the only floor covering. It was a breeding ground for disease, with fleas and lice thriving in the unsanitary conditions. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was a challenge. Without a proper understanding of hygiene, even the most lavish banquets could end in tragedy. The story of King John of England serves as a poignant example. In 1216, while travelling through the country, the king fell ill after consuming an excess of peaches. Historians now believe these peaches were likely spoiled, leading to a case of dysentery that ultimately claimed the king's life. In the overcrowded towns of medieval Europe, the situation was even more dire. Narrow streets were choked with garbage and human waste, contaminating the air and seeping into the water supply. In London, the River Thames served as both a source of drinking water and a dumping ground for the city's waste. It's no wonder that diseases ran rampant, with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the dreaded Black Death. The Black Death that swept across Europe in the 14th century was in part able to spread so rapidly and claim so many lives due to the unsanitary conditions of medieval towns. Fleas carried by the rats that thrived in the filth became unwitting heralds of the plague, spreading the disease from person to person with terrifying efficiency. For the average peasant, there was little escape from these unsanitary conditions. They lived and died amidst the dirt. Their bodies weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to disease. Even the simple act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment and comfort, became a game of chance with every bite. As we consider these realities, it's easy to feel a sense of despair for the plight of the medieval peasant. But amidst this darkness, there were glimmers of light, the kindness of neighbors sharing the little they had, the solace found in faith and community. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the Church, despite its own role in the hardships of the era, also offered a measure of relief and hope to the hungry and the oppressed. Part 6. The Church's Influence. The tolling of church bells marked the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. For peasants toiling in the fields, these chimes signaled not only the call to prayer, but also a respite from the relentless demands of their labor and their hunger. In a world where so much was uncertain, the Church stood as a bastion of stability and authority. But this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which revolved around food. The Catholic Church required frequent fasts and meatless days, particularly during the penitential season of Lent. For 40 days before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs. A difficult task for those already struggling to put food on the table. The story of one peasant family illustrates the hardships these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret toiled from dawn to dusk on their small plot of land, barely growing enough to feed their 3 children. When Lent arrived, they faced a daunting choice: honor the fast and risk weakening their already undernourished bodies, or defy the Church and face the consequences for their immortal souls. In the end, they chose to follow the fast, subsisting on meager portions of bread, porridge, and occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were gaunt and their steps heavy with exhaustion. Yet, they took solace in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. Despite the added hardships imposed by these fasts, the Church was not entirely unsympathetic to the plight of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often served as a source of food aid, distributing bread and alms to the needy as a form of Christian charity. The monks, with their vast lands and resources, were able to provide a measure of relief to the hungry masses. However, even this charity had its limits. When harvests failed and famine struck, the demand for aid often outstripped the Church's ability to provide. And for those caught poaching in the royal forests, a desperate attempt to supplement their meagre diets with fresh game, the Church's mercy was conspicuously absent. Poachers, if caught, faced severe punishments, ranging from mutilation to death, regardless of their circumstances. And so, the Church's influence on medieval food was a double-edged sword. It provided solace and aid to some while imposing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and yet another trial to be endured in the face of relentless hunger. As we turn our gaze to the final chapter of our journey through medieval food, we will witness a scene of shocking contrast, the opulent banquet of a noble house against the backdrop of peasant hardship. These lavish displays serve as a poignant reminder of the vast inequalities that define the era. Part 7. The Rare Medieval Banquet. The great hall of the castle is alive with the flicker of 100 candles. Tapestries adorn the walls, their vibrant threads telling stories of heroic deeds and courtly love. At the head of the hall, on a raised dais, the lord and lady preside over a scene of opulence and plenty. In the center of the hall stretches a massive oak table, groaning under the weight of countless dishes. Whole roasted boars, their skins and storling in golden, vie for space with elegant silver platters of delicately spiced peacock. Baskets overflow with fresh, soft bread, each loaf as white and fluffy as a cloud. The air is thick with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves, spices so precious they are worth their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the master cook orchestrates a symphony of culinary creation. He barks orders to his underlings who scurry to baste the meats, stir the pots, and implant the elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures crafted into fantastical shapes of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this banquet is a chance to showcase his artistry and ingenuity, to solidify his reputation and secure his place in his lord's favor. As the banquet progresses, the diners gorge themselves on a seemingly endless parade of dishes. They tear into tender meat of roasted, slurp creamy almond soup, and savor the delicate flavor of blanc mi. A dish of shredded chicken mixed with rice milk and sugar. They wash it all down with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. But even amidst this revelry, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval life. One noble woman, her face flushed with wine, suddenly pales and excuses herself from the table, her stomach churning from the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth rotted by the sugary delicacies, bites into a particularly tough piece of meat and winces in pain. And lingering at the edges of the hall, the servants watch the excesses of their betters with a mix of envy and resentment. They know that tomorrow they'll be back to their usual fare of coarse bread and thin porridge, the memory of this feast, a tantalizing reminder of the chasm between their world and that of their masters. As the last dishes are cleared and the final crumbs swept away, we are left to ponder the stark contrasts of medieval food. For the nobility, banquets were a display of wealth, status, and power, a chance to feast on the finest delicacies the earth had to offer. But for the vast majority, food was a daily struggle, a constant battle against scarcity, adulteration, and disease. In our modern world of abundance and choice, it's easy to forget the hardships faced by our medieval ancestors. But by understanding their struggles, we gain a deeper appreciation for the comforts we enjoy today. As we sit down to our own meals, let us take a moment to savor not just the flavors on our tongues, but the hard-won progress that allows us to eat with such ease and variety. And so, as we close the book on this exploration of medieval food, let us do so with a sense of gratitude and perspective. For in the grand tapestry of human history, our own time is but a brief and privileged chapter, to have been from the threads of countless lives lived and meals shared, each one a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Conclusion: as we've journeyed through the landscape of medieval food, we've encountered a world of scarcity, hardship, and inequality. From the monotonous blandness of peasant pottage to the dangerous fillers in adulterated bread, the challenges of feeding oneself in the Middle Ages were relentless. We've seen how the lack of variety in spices, the difficulties of preservation, unbalanced diets, and unsanitary conditions conspire to make medieval food vastly different from the cornucopias we enjoy today. We've witnessed the impact of the Church's fasting edicts, adding spiritual burdens to the already heavy load of the poor, and we've marveled at the opulent banquets of the nobility, a bright contrast to the bleak realities faced by the majority. But through it all, we've also seen glimpses of humanity's indomitable spirit, the ingenuity of cooks making the most of scarce ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing the little they had, and the solace found in the rituals of faith and feasting. In our modern world, it's easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can dine in restaurants serving cuisines from across the globe or have a world of flavors delivered right to our door. But imagine for a moment transporting a medieval peasant into the aisles of a modern grocery store. The sheer variety would be overwhelming. The vibrant colors of the produce section, the gleaming refrigerated displays full of milk and eggs, the shelves and shelves of pre-packaged meals and snacks. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We grapple with the environmental impact of our food systems, with issues of access and inequality, and with the health consequences of overabundance. In our pursuit of convenience and choice, we sometimes forget the value of simplicity, of seasonal eating, and of local flavors. Perhaps then there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors. Even as we appreciate how far we've come, we can embrace the joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, the satisfaction of a dish made with care and creativity. We can remember the value of preserving and cherishing the bounty of the land instead of taking it for granted. And most of all, we can approach our own meals with a sense of gratitude and wonder, recognizing the incredible journey that food has made to reach our plates. From the sun-drenched fields to the bustling kitchens, to the warmth of our own tables. Every bite is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit across the ages. So, as we close our journey through the annals of medieval food, let us raise a toast or perhaps a humble wooden goblet, the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundations for the world we live in today. And by honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where everyone can eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. As the royal cook bustled about the castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast, most of his countrymen could only dream of such opulence. For the serf toiling in the fields, a meal was a simple affair of coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew of whatever vegetables or scraps could be found. On a good day, there might be a bit of salted pork or dried fish to add some flavor to the gruel-like concoction, but more often than not, it was a bland and unsatisfying meal that left one's belly only half full. The life of a peasant in medieval times was one of relentless hardship, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their daily sustenance. While nobles dined on exotic dishes spiced with expensive spices from distant lands, common folk subsisted on a diet as monotonous as it was meager. But even the privileged were not immune to the dangers of medieval food. The lavish banquets, which were the hallmark of aristocratic life, often came with a hidden cost. Without means of refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat, and many nobles fell ill or even died from consuming contaminated food. The very excesses that were meant to display their wealth and status could be their undoing. Such was the fate of King John of England, whose untimely death in 1216 was attributed to an overindulgence of peaches. According to the story, the king was travelling through the town of King's Lynn when he was struck down by a terrible case of dysentery. Some say it was caused by the rich food he had consumed at a nearby abbey, while others blamed the peaches he had eaten with gusto. Whatever the cause, the king's condition rapidly worsened, and he died a few days later, his reign cut short by a humble fruit. It is a testament to the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages that even the most powerful and privileged were not safe from the dangers that lurked in their food. For the vast majority of people, however, the risks were even greater. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, the temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too great to resist. This was especially true in times of scarcity, when crops failed and food was scarce. During these lean years, people resorted to eating whatever they could find, even if it meant risking their health or even their lives. Acorns, grass, and other wild plants were often ground into a coarse flour to make bread, while animals that had died of disease were sometimes consumed out of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that would be unthinkable today. Unscrupulous bakers stretched their dough with fillers like sawdust or chalk, while brewers watered down their ale to increase their profits. Such practices were not only dishonest, but also dangerous, as they could lead to serious illness or even death. The alewife who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life, and one who often suffered from the suspicions and resentments of the community. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with harmful substances or even of practicing witchcraft. In a world where superstition was rife, the line between a bad batch of ale and a deadly poison was often thin. Despite the many challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of respite and togetherness. And for the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders were further restricted. For 40 long days, they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and occasional vegetables or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and draw closer to God. But for others, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was so often scarce and unpredictable, the idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed the height of insanity. And yet, despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of the few ingredients available, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is a reminder of how far we have come in terms of food security, variety, and abundance, but also of how much we still have in common with our ancestors. For just as they struggled to put food on the table and nourish their families, so too do we grapple with the challenges of our own time, from climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life. As we sit down to our own meals laden with a dizzying array of flavors and ingredients from every corner of the globe, it's easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that brought us to this point. But by understanding the history of our food and the ways in which it has shaped our culture and our identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity we enjoy today. So, the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that brought us to this point and give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who toil to put food on our tables and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of the greatest challenges. Perhaps if a medieval peasant were somehow transported to a modern supermarket, they would be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from distant lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles and aisles of packaged and processed foods. But they might also feel a sense of unease or even suspicion, wondering about the hidden costs and compromises that made such abundance possible. They might question the methods by which our food is grown and raised, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. In the end, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with the simple food that sustained them for generations. For while our modern food system may offer us greater choice and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own challenges and drawbacks. And just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what they had, to find joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, so too must we learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies, but also our souls, that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and that leave a legacy of health and abundance for future generations. So, let us raise a toast to the humble peasant, to the hard-working farmer, to the skilled artisan, and to all those who have toiled to put food on our tables throughout history. Let us savor the flavors and textures of the food we eat, not just as a source of sustenance, but as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. And let us never forget the power of food to unite us, to nourish our bodies and spirits, and to remind us of our shared humanity in the face of the greatest challenges. As we have seen, the medieval spice trade was a lucrative yet dangerous business. Those who controlled the flow of spices could amass great fortunes, while those who toiled to bring these precious commodities to Europe risked life and limb. One such spice merchant was a man named Giovanni de Marignarli. Born in the early 11th century to a noble Florentine family, Giovanni seemed destined for a life of ease and comfort, but a restless spirit and a thirst for adventure led him down a different path. In 1338, Giovanni set out on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the bustling ports of Italy, the distant lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, his official purpose was to spread the Christian faith. But Giovanni was also a shrewd businessman, always on the lookout for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's travels were fraught with peril at every turn. He crossed the vast deserts of Central Asia, facing sandstorms and bandits. He navigated treacherous mountain passes in the Himalayas, battling altitude sickness and frostbite. He sailed the stormy seas of the Indian Ocean, praying to survive each monsoon season. But for all the hardships he endured, Giovanni was also enchanted by the wonders he encountered. He marveled at the gleaming white palaces of Cambarli, the Mongol capital, later known as Beijing. He admired the pious devotion of the Christians of St. Thomas in southern India. He reveled in the intoxicating aromas and flavors of the spice markets in San and Malabar. Along the way, Giovanni amassed a rich cargo of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, carefully packed into chests to protect them from moisture during the long journey home. He knew that if he could bring these spices back to Italy safely, he would make a fortune, but Giovanni's luck would not last. According to some accounts, his ship was lost at sea on the return voyage, taking him and his precious spices to the salty depths. Other stories claim that he survived the journey only to be robbed and murdered by highwaymen on the outskirts of Florence, his spices scattered to the wind. Whatever the truth of his fate, the story of Giovanni de Marignarli reminds us of the incredible risks and rewards of the medieval spice trade. For a lucky few wealthy and adventurous merchants, spices could be a ticket to untold riches, but for the majority, like Giovanni, they remained a tantalizing dream, always just out of reach. As we drift off to sleep, let us imagine we are in a bustling spice market in some distant corner of the medieval world. The air is thick with the scent of pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and saffron. Merchants haggle in a dozen different tongues, their voices rising and falling like the tide. We wander through the narrow alleyways, baskets in hand, marveling at the colorful piles of spices from every corner of the globe. Here a heap of ginger root, node and pungent. There a pile of cloves, like tiny brown nails, their aroma warm sweet. But as we fill our baskets, we cannot help but feel a pang of regret for the many who will never taste these flavors. For the poor peasants back home, a pinch of pepper would be an unthinkable luxury, let alone a fragrant curry or a spiced wine. Their food, as we will explore further, is a monotonous routine of gruel and grains, a far cry from the sumptuous feasts we've seen on the tables of the rich. But even those lavish banquets, as we'll soon discover, could come with their own hidden dangers and unpleasant surprises. So, let us savor this imagined abundance, this rare sensory delight, as we delve deeper into dreams. For when we awaken, we'll have to confront once more the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, realities that made the act of filling one's belly a daily battle for prince and pauper alike. The scarcity and hardship that defined medieval food for the masses extended even to the basic staples that formed the backbone of their diets. Bread, the most basic and universal of foods, was often a coarse and unappetizing loaf that would be almost unrecognizable today. For the poorest peasants, bread was made from inferior grains such as barley, rye, and even beans or chestnuts in times of scarcity. This resulted in dense, dark loaves that were difficult to digest and provided little nutrition. The bread was often full of gritty impurities due to poor milling techniques and would quickly become stale or moldy in the damp conditions of many peasant homes. Even for slightly more affluent peasants who could afford wheat bread, the end product was far from the fluffy, leavened loaves we enjoy today. Leavening agents like yeast were expensive and hard to come by. So, most bread was flatbread, similar to modern pita bread. These flatbreads were baked on a hearthstone or dried in the sun, resulting in a hard, cracker-like consistency. The quality of bread was so important that it was often used as a marker of social class. The whitest and finest loaves, made from pure wheat flour, were reserved for the nobility, while the greyish-brown loaves of the peasant population were derided as black bread. In some regions, strict laws even forbade commoners from consuming white bread, reserving it as a privilege of the elite. One figure who stands out in the history of medieval bread production was the 11th century mystic saint Degard of Bingen. Born into a noble family in what is now Germany, Hildegard entered monastic life at a young age and assumed to become an abbess of her own community. In addition to her spiritual writings, visionary insights, and musical compositions, Hildegard was known for her knowledge of herbalism and natural medicine. She wrote extensively about the properties of grains and the importance of proper nutrition, even in an age when such ideas were not widely understood. In her treatise Physiker, Hildegard described spelter, an ancient grain closely related to wheat, as the best grain for human consumption. She believed that spelt bread nourished the body and enhanced longevity, while also cautioning against the consumption of cross cereals as detrimental to health. Hildegard put her knowledge into practice, overseeing her abbey's extensive farmlands and bakery. Under her guidance, the nuns of Bing produced high-quality spelt bread, which was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. While spelter was still a luxury commodity beyond the reach of most peasants, Degard's advocacy of it as a healthier alternative to common wheat was remarkably insightful. Modern nutritional science has vindicated many of her claims, showing spelt to be richer in protein and easier to digest for many people than highly processed modern wheat. Degard of Bing's life and work provide a glimpse into the crucial role that bread played in medieval society, not just as a staple food, but as a symbol of social status and a potential tool for healing. Her teachings, informed by a holistic understanding of the connection between food and health, foreshadowed modern ideas about nutrition and well-being. Despite the efforts of visionaries like Hildegard, bread for the majority of people in the Middle Ages remained a coarse, bone staple, often scarce. The unequal distribution of this basic necessity was just one more way in which the rigid class divisions of medieval society manifested themselves in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the meager comfort of a regular supply of bread could be snatched away by the cruel whims of fate and weather. In times of drought, flood, or plague, when grain harvests failed, the spectre of famine loomed large over medieval communities. During these dreaded years of scarcity, food prices skyrocketed while wages plummeted, leaving many peasants unable to afford even a basic subsistence. With no social safety net to fall back on, the poorest were left to starve or resort to desperate measures such as eating bark, grass, or even cannibalism in the most extreme cases. One of the worst famines to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. A catastrophic confluence of factors, including climate change, crop failures, and the economic fallout of endless wars, plunged the continent into a 7-year period of starvation and misery. Chronicles from the time paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by common people. Men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, wrote the Flemish monk William of Nantes. Some men, it was said, compelled by hunger, ate the bodies of executed criminals, and some poor folk even ate their own children. The famine hit the Low Countries and Scandinavia particularly hard, with mortality rates as high as 10 to 25% in some regions. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of 16 deaths per day compared to only 2 per day in normal times. Even in the best of times, the threat of hunger was never far from medieval peasants. Their precarious existence, always at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their lords, meant that food insecurity was a constant companion. The harsh reality of famine cast a long shadow over the medieval world, serving as a reminder of the fragility of life in an era before modern agriculture and social welfare. It was a world where even the most basic necessity of bread could not be taken for granted, and where the spectre of starvation lurked just one bad harvest away. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we will see how this widespread scarcity and insecurity shaped not only the diets, but the entire worldview of medieval people. In an age when a full belly was a luxury and a stale crust a treasure, food took on a significance hard to imagine, from our modern vantage point, of abundance and choice. But first let's turn our attention to another medieval diet staple, which was little more appetizing than the bread of the era, meat. For all but the wealthiest nobles, meat was a rare treat, reserved for special occasions. And when it did appear on the menu, it often came in forms that would turn the stomachs of modern diners. In the absence of refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on a variety of preservation methods to keep meat from spoiling. Salting was the most common technique, with heavily salted meats being a staple in winter diets. But the salt itself was often of poor quality, full of impurities that could make the meat taste bad or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were also used to preserve meats, particularly in the form of sausages and hams. These could last for longer periods, but would become tough and unappetizing over time, with a texture more akin to leather than the succulent, tender meats we enjoy today. For most peasants, meat usually meant tough, stringy cuts from older animals that were no longer useful for milk or labor. Beef was rarely eaten by commoners, as cattle were simply too valuable to be slaughtered. Pork and poultry were somewhat more common, but were still luxury items for most. The type and quantity of meat in medieval diets varied significantly by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people relied largely on freshwater fish rather than land meat. Hunting was a coveted privilege of the nobility, who jealously guarded their exclusive rights to venison and other game. A vivid glimpse into the inequality of medieval meat consumption comes from the records of King Richard II's cooks in the late 10th century. For a single royal feast in 1387, the kitchens prepared 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 501,000 piglets. A meal fit for a king. Indeed. In contrast, a peasant family could expect to eat meat only a few times a year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the cuts would be meager and would have been scrupulously hoarded for months. But for a brief moment in medieval England's history, the humble peasant population tasted the abundance usually reserved for their betters. A fallout of the Black Death that killed up to half the population in the mid-11th century. The massive labor shortage gave the surviving peasants new bargaining power. With fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land, many peasants found themselves in the novel position of being able to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For a few short decades, the standard of living for English commoners actually improved sharply. Meat consumption increased as more peasants could afford to raise livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. Wages doubled or even tripled in some regions, allowing working families to supplement their usual fare of pottage and bread with an occasional chicken, pig, or even a cow. But this golden age for the peasantry would be short-lived. The landowning nobility, alarmed by the growing power of the lower classes, reacted with laws that attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind peasants to the land. The tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would cloud in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Though the revolt was brutally suppressed, with its leaders executed and its gains largely reversed, it stands as a testament to the transformative impact of the Black Death on medieval society. For a brief and shining moment, the common people of England tasted a life less bounded by scarcity and toil. But for most of the Middle Ages, and for most people, meat remained a rare and coveted delicacy. Its scarcity made it a powerful symbol of status and wealth, a tangible reminder of the chasm between the haves and have-nots. In the grand halls of castles and manors, nobles and knights feasted on platters piled high with roasted game and delicate fowl, washing it down with fine wines and mead. But in the hovels of the peasantry, a piece of salted pork or a stringy chicken leg was a hard-won delicacy, to be savoured and stretched as far as possible. This disparity in access to such a basic food underlines the harsh inequalities that defined life in the Middle Ages. In a world where even a full belly was a mark of privilege, the gulf between rich and poor was as wide as the distance between a king's banquet table and a peasant's empty trough. As we have seen, the rare bite of meat was a highlight in the otherwise monotonous and grim diet of most medieval people. But even this small pleasure was subject to strict regulation by the power of the Church. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of daily life, and food was no exception. The church calendar was dotted with fast days and meatless days, when the consumption of animal products was strictly forbidden. The most significant of these was the season of Lent, the 40-day period leading up to Easter. During this time, all meat, dairy, and eggs were off limits, leaving the faithful to subsist on a meager diet of fish, vegetables, and bread. For the wealthy nobles, this was a minor inconvenience. They could import exotic fruits, nuts, and spices to liven up their Lenten fare. And their well-stocked fish ponds ensured a constant supply of fresh seafood. But for the poor, Lent meant an even more restricted and monotonous diet than usual. The Church's rationale for these dietary restrictions was rooted in the idea of penitence and spiritual discipline. By denying themselves the pleasures of the flesh, Even in the form of food, the faithful were meant to purify their souls and align themselves with the suffering of Christ. But in a world where hunger and scarcity were daily realities for most people, the idea of voluntary deprivation must have seemed a bitter irony. For peasants who rarely tasted meat anyway, the imposition of additional restrictions could feel like a cruel joke. Yet, the Church's power was so great that few dared to openly defy its dietary decrees. To do so was to risk not only social ostracism, but the very real threat of eternal damnation. In an age when the afterlife was considered more real and important than earthly existence, this was a powerful deterrent. Indeed, a poignant tale that illustrates the hardships of Lenten fasting comes from the records of an 11th century English estate. In 1322, a peasant woman named Agnes Parton was brought before the manorial court on a charge of stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. In her defense, Agnes pleaded that she had stolen bread to feed her starving children, who were too young to understand the rules of fasting. She begged for mercy, arguing that surely God would not wish his innocent infants to go hungry. The court, moved by her plea, took the uncommon step of acquitting Agnes of the theft charge, but still rebuked her for breaking the Lenten fast, reminding her that the needs of the soul must take precedence over the desires of the body. For Agnes and countless others like her, the Church's rigid dietary restrictions must have felt like just one more burden in a life already defined by hardship and hunger. In a world where food was scarce and survival precarious, the idea of voluntarily giving up what little sustenance was available must have been a tough pill to swallow. But the Church's influence on medieval food culture was not entirely negative. Monasteries and abbeys were often at the forefront of agricultural innovation, pioneering new techniques in crop rotation, irrigation, and selection. They also served as repositories of classical knowledge about farming and food preservation, keeping alive the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece. Furthermore, the Church played a vital role in providing food aid to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were known for their charitable distribution of bread and ale to the needy, and many operated hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick indigent. In an age before social welfare programs or organized charity, the Church was often the only safety net available to the most vulnerable members of society. Its teachings on the virtues of charity and the sin of gluttony helped to create a moral imperative.